Plurality. On behalf of all of us at Hacked Off, we'd like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you for coming along to our 4th annual Leveson lecture. It's my role, as it is every year, to give you a few housekeeping points. So in the event of an emergency, the exits to the bar are here and here. If there's a fire, just run for your life out the back, right? So we're done. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce the Right Honourable Sir Vincent Cable. Of course, Sir Vince is best known for his ballroom dancing. But in his spare time, he was the Secretary of State for Business, Innovation and Skills and the President of the Board of Trade during the coalition government between 2010 and 2015. He was a Member of Parliament for Twickenham between 1997 and 2015 and Deputy Leader of the Liberal Democrat Party between 2007 and 2010. Vince has had an incredibly distinguished career. Started out reading natural sciences and economics at Cambridge University, where he was president of the union, and that was followed by a PhD at Glasgow University. After advising the Kenyan government on treasury finance, he lectured at Glasgow University in economics as well. Vince worked for the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. He worked for the Overseas Development Institute and was a special advisor to the Commonwealth Secretary General as well. Vince is currently a professor at the LSE and has a number of visiting professorships as well. You've heard enough of me. I'm delighted to invite Vince to take the floor, to put his best foot forward, groans at the back, and to take us forward to talk about Leveson implementation and where the campaign is at right now. Over to you, Vince.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your very warm welcome. It is an honour to be asked to do this. I mean, it's very flattering. And I asked myself why you'd asked me to come here. My one experience was with Brian Leveson was actually on the witness stand at his inquiry, which was actually a rather gruelling experience in my rather gruelling 5 years as Secretary of State. But it does give me an opportunity to talk about what has been called the elephant in the room, which is the whole issue of interconnected issues of ownership and plurality in relation to the media. I look back on the Leveson inquiry, and only 6 of the 146 paragraphs in the summary of his report actually touched on this, and it's got rather absorbed in all of the end saga about the Royal Charter. But I was an economic minister in the government, and I'm an economist by training, and I'm naturally interested in the whole issue about market dominance and monopoly. And I'm also a political practitioner and a Democrat, and I do care about the progression from market dominance to market abuse. Now, whether it's in the market for books or banking or pubs or football or newspapers, which is what we're talking about here. Moreover, the issue of media plurality was the occasion of my one really bad experience with the press. I mean, you know, if you're in political life, there's a kind of rough and tumble about it. I had one really big and bad experience beyond that. And maybe some of you should remember the occasion when a group of Lib Dem ministers, I was one, were eavesdropped in our advice surgeries by people posing as constituents but were actually reporters from the Daily Telegraph. I don't bring that here because I want to rehearse a grievance or perpetuate a quarrel, because actually what happened in that particular case is that we did get an apology, but of course, as these apologies often are, it was tucked away very discreetly on an inside page in marked contrast to the sensation on the front page, which announced the story in the first place. But my own involvement and comments on the the B Sky B takeover, which you may remember, had much more serious and prolonged repercussions. I discovered, for example, sometimes later, that my constituency office waste bags were being emptied for the very best part of the year by somebody, as it happens unsuccessfully, looking for incriminating material. I then discovered that my tax files mysteriously ended up in the hands of one of our leading tabloids. There wasn't in either case anything to sustain a scandal, but I took the view that rather than become obsessed by conspiracy theory, I should rationalise these activities as the work of elves and fairies. And when I met the editor and journalists of the tabloid concern, I agreed with them that it was indeed the work of elves and fairies, and partly because of that we got on very well subsequently. But I realised, as I'm sure they did, that there was a bad Santa behind the elves and fairies. Nonetheless, what I now want to do is to go on and deal with the question of plurality. But before doing that, perhaps I can summarise my own personal experience in a rugby metaphor, which is perhaps appropriate because I used to represent Twickenham. What I did do through my intervention was to stop a certain try, which was in the form of an attacking player, a well-known media proprietor, by pushing him into touch. But unfortunately, a video referee spotted that I'd thrown a punch as well as a tackle, and I spent 10 minutes in the sin bin. But when I reflect back on that experience, however, I tend to dwell on the try-saving tackle, which has had the effect of keeping the score, media plurality, pretty much as it is for the last 6 years. But can't be complacent. The game is still on. Things could change, and media plurality as an issue is still very much alive, and that's what I want to talk about. Now, the origins of public interest in media plurality go back a very long way. You may remember that the post-war Labour government launched a major royal commission into this subject. The Conservative Prime Minister Harold Macmillan followed with another one. And I was reminded how topical this issue was a generation or 2 generations ago, because I recently dug out the first article I ever had published, which was as a university undergraduate. And it was on the subject of press empires. I reflected, why had I chosen to write about this subject as a young undergraduate? And I think the reason lay in my own family. I had a very political father. He belonged to what would now be called the alt-right, very much in the Trump, Farage tradition. And our daily diet of news and opinion came from the Daily Mail and the Sunday Express. Now, I perhaps should add that when we'd completed the transition from Sarah's house with outside loo to a posh detached house, we moved to the Daily Telegraph. But anyway, I was brought up on the Mail and the Express. There was, of course, also the BBC. Radio and television was just beginning, but we had the BBC. My dad tended to regard the BBC as run by communists, and so we had to fall back on the balanced opinions of the Mail and the Express. By the time I arrived at college, I was beginning to suspect that there was something not quite right about this world view. But I remained fascinated by the fact that somebody who was as thoughtful and intelligent and actually as lovable as my dad had been captivated by this way of thinking. And I recalled in the article I wrote Churchill when he made the observation that the empires of the future will be empires of the mind. And some things never change. I mean, I recall to this day listening to my Conservative colleagues in the coalition fulminating about lefties and liberals controlling the Today programme, and the Bean being far too partial about the causes of the First World War. And there was a rather strong sort of parallel between my experience as a child, remembering my dad throwing slippers at the radio when we were withdrawing from Suez. But in many other respects, the world is different. And those things, some of those things continue, but the world is in other respects different. We're writing about a world today in which the circulation of newspapers is very much diminished. When I was a child, the Daily Express had a circulation of about 4.5 million, which contrasts with the biggest today, which is the Sun, with about 1.8 million. TV was not really in contention. It was difficult to see it through the snowstorm of bad tuning. The BBC, of course, had a radio monopoly, but you were beginning to get pirate radio coming on the scene. But in those sense, it was quite different. But in other respects, the political structure, if you like, the political topography, was quite similar to what it is today. 2/3 of all newspaper circulation was accounted for by 3 groups. There was Associated, which is the Daily Mail, the Mirror Group, of course now Trinity Mirror, and Beaverbrook's Express. And today the proportions are actually very similar. 72% of circulation today is accounted for by 4 groups, and I'm contrasting this with 50 years ago. And essentially they're the same group. Of course, Beaverbrook has now been replaced by Richard Desmond, but the structure is rather similar. There is, of course, one major new kid on the block, which is the Murdoch Press. It has the largest share, just under 30%. And the Mail, interestingly, has almost exactly the same market share as it had half a century ago. It occupies exactly the same niche in the daily press market. For Sundays, the concentration was and is even greater. 84% of the top 3 at that today, but it's with the Murdoch Press now having the largest share, and Richard Desmond, of course, has again displaced the Beaverbrook Press. In a way more significant, and I will dwell on this a little bit as I go on, is in relation to the regional press, because we then had a very diverse regional press. It's now very, very highly concentrated. 5 companies effectively control 70% of daily circulation in the regional press, and we've had the disappearance of numerous independent titles, and actually 100% monopoly now exists in about 1/3 of all local authority areas, and many, of course, don't have local press at all. And now, should we be concerned about this? I mean, from the standpoint of plurality, competition, I mean, does it matter that you have such a concentration of ownership? I mean, you do have this in, of course, many other industries. I mean, if we were talking about cars or baked beans or financial services or hospitality, this degree of concentration probably wouldn't be a matter of great concern. In terms of the standard way in which we look at competition, it's still possible to enter the market with new business models. You've had the eye. It's still possible for new proprietors to enter. You've had Evgeny Lebedev and Richard Desmond in recent years. And there are no substitutes in other media. So if one was conducting a fairly orthodox competition inquiry, the conclusion would probably be that there isn't a great risk. However, and the however is very important, however, this is a market that is fundamentally and qualitatively quite different from cars and baked beans and financial services because of politics. And it's politics that creates the problem of plurality. Let me just explain it in this way. I think ever since the Second World War, the politics of the right, broadly defined, has tended to be dominant in the press, with the exception of the Mirror Group. And the Mirror Group has declined from 20% when I wrote about it as a student, to about 10% today. And of course the growth of the Murdoch newspapers has further shifted the balance. I've attempted as just a crude categorization, just to get a flavour of this. If we take the newspapers that you can very loosely classify as the populist right, now people may have trouble with that definition, but you've got the Sun, the Mail, the Express, the Star. They account for about 70% of circulation on both a daily and a Sunday basis. About 15% is what I would loosely call the establishment right, i.e. the Times and the Telegraph. The Telegraph might balk at being called the establishment, but they would balk at being called right, I suspect. And the remaining 15%, it's only 15%, is accounted for by papers that broadly link to the centre-left, in other words, the Mirror plus the limited circulation broadsheets. Now, that is, I hesitate to say, I mean, it is a very crude generalisation. You could say, well, why have I put the Star in there? Unless you regard headlines like Freddie Starr ate my hamster as a secret political message, they're not very political. And one of the other major Sunday papers, the Mail on Sunday, has a pretty maverick, independent-minded editorial line. I write for them, so I can commend them. But however you calculate it, the disproportion, the political disproportions, are absolutely gross. Now, the standard response to that is to say, well, so what? You know, if you want to get news and comment, newspapers are just a third of what they were half a century ago. You can always go to other media, and in particular, young people will go to online media. And of course, you've got the BBC and the television channels with public service obligation. I mean, that's the standard answer to the very heavy bias in the print press. But there's some really interesting research that's been done by Cardiff and separately by Loughborough and King's College London, which shows that the 2015 general election BBC news agenda was actually led consistently by the print media. The idea that they acted as some kind of counterweight simply doesn't stand up to experience. That wasn't the way it worked. And moreover, the extreme lengths to which some politicians go to cultivate newspaper proprietors makes it abundantly clear where the power really lies. The Leveson inquiry and the House of Commons Culture Select Committee documented in toe-curling detail some of the obsequiousness with which many politicians have grovelled to proprietors. And Lord Leveson described him, this is in his words, at the level of some proprietors, editors and senior executives, the media are highly skilled at subtle and intuitive lobbying in the context of personal relationships and friendships. And sadly, I was never invited to go riding with Rebecca Brooks, but I think that's what his lordship was talking about. Now, where political bias matters, or has mattered, most strikingly in the recent past, was in the referendum debate on Brexit, where you had a very high concentration of support amongst the newspapers that I've classified as on the populist right, but with the important qualification that the Mail group had a split loyalty, because the Mail on Sunday was a Remain newspaper, perhaps surprisingly, but it was. And I want to stress, I'm making this point not because I'm a Remainer, I was, and indeed am. And I don't think politicians can fairly complain about the media in this particular respect. They didn't have to have a referendum. If I could just choose a metaphor, I mean, if you wander into a cage with a man-eating tiger, you can't really complain if you finish up inside it, which is essentially what happened. It was stupidity and carelessness as much as anything else which caused that referendum. But that said, and I'm trying to be, as you can see, fair-minded here, the vitriolic attacks on other institutions whose independence is no less important to democracy than that of the press, such as the judiciary, has been, frankly, pretty despicable. But whatever our views about particular newspapers, about particular opinions and particular owners, the health of the press depends on there being a range of independent providers. In other words, plurality as opposed to competition, because you can get intense competition, but it fails to provide a range of independent sources of news and information. Plurality matters, in the words of the Journal of Media Law, because where a few firms dominate the media landscape, they exercise considerable control. There's now a convincing body of evidence to suggest that particular corporate or political affiliates can lead to media bias or the suppression of information. And Ofcom, the media regulator, has stressed the importance of plurality, as it puts it, by preventing too much influence over the political process. But how do we know whether plurality is enough or appropriate? And there isn't, unfortunately, any very precise definition to help us. I think beyond a belief that we need to have a wide variety of owners for different media outlets. Thanks to Lord Putnam, who intervened in the parliamentary passage of the Enterprise Act and then in the Competition Act in 15 years ago, there is now a power for the relevant Secretary of State to intervene when a proposed merger takes place that he believes compromises media plurality. And that was the power that I exercised in referring News Corp and B-Sky B takeover to the competition authorities. But it's important to realise the restrictions around this power. It relates to particular transactions rather than ongoing trends in plurality. Since that particular takeover and all the controversy around it, there has been no other. And so there's been no pretext under law to investigate where plurality is a major issue, as it undoubtedly is with the local press, where 141 papers have disappeared, or for that matter in the new internet news market. And it's quite difficult also to separate out those elements of market abuse that relate to economics, as it were, and those that relate to politics, where we're talking about political influence. Obviously, the controversies around the media, the Murdoch Group, apply. But in the case of NewsQuest, which is dominant provider of local newspapers, the issues there are essentially economic. As far as I know, it has no political agenda. There are undoubtedly issues in terms of the consumers, the readers, and in terms of the workforce. You may well discover in your area that local journalists are on strike more than once because of the problems in that sector. Now, the Media Reform Coalition has helpfully made an assessment about how much plurality we actually have in the different media markets. It chronicles, for example, the continued consolidation and loss of plurality in local and regional newspapers. For example, I just give some figures which bring this out in a very striking way. 3 years ago, which is as late as the numbers go, if you break it down to 380 local authority areas, 100 had no local print newspaper left. 143 had a 100% monopoly. and only one out of 380 had a competitive market for local newspapers, and that's the Scottish borough of Fife, which had 2 newspapers contesting the market. And actually, that sounds pretty extreme, but I'm understating the problem, because what tends to happen is that the largest circulation local media group, which is Trinity Mirror, has a significant ownership stake in others, as indeed does DMG, which is the Mail. And when this is allowed for, Trinity Mirror has 65 local monopolies, that's with over 50% share of the market, and NewsQuest has 67. The numbers have almost certainly grown in the 3 years since then. Now, where else can you get plurality from, if not from the press? Well, one of them, of course, is internet news. It's a way of strengthening plurality. It brings in new suppliers. However, in terms of reach, it's important to stress that almost all of the online news sites come through established channels like BBC, the Mail, the Guardian. We do have 1 or 2 small independent new groups coming along, Huffington Post, to a degree, a small degree, BuzzFeed adds to that. And surveys of internet use suggest that many people do access their news via Facebook, Google, Twitter, but these are essentially intermediaries or aggregators. They're not providing additional sources, they don't generate their own news and comment, and the actual content invariably relies on BBC or Sky or one of the other key providers. However, this is, backward looking. If we want to look at the future and the emerging trends, there are some very powerful and actually on balance pretty disturbing things now taking place. We've seen these new online sites specializing in very aggressive, ideologically loaded content, like Breitbart in the United States, had a significant influence on the 2016 presidential election. There's been a vast proliferation of propaganda sites operating through the main media platforms, Google and Facebook, some of them containing the most egregious kind of hate material directed at Jews or black people or women. And what is now happening is that they're gaining enormous reach. These are not just tiny niches. They're gaining enormous reach because there's some very clever manipulation taking place of the algorithms which determine the rank order by which you access material when you look through search material. There's also the phenomenon of fake news, which we're hearing more about. There is a very large firm, actually based in Montenegro, in the Balkans, generating mass manufacturing fake news because it's politically influential or maybe in some cases entertaining. So the optimism that originally existed that internet news would provide genuine plurality is now fading as it becomes clear that there are unparalleled opportunities opening up to manipulate and falsify information. Right, so the press, internet provision, what else? We've got radio and television, but here again, plurality may be more apparent than real. There are a dozen radio channels, but when you trace back the ownership, it essentially comes down to 2. The BBC accounts for an audience share of about 55%, but Sky accounts for almost all the remainder. Channels like Heart, Capital, Classic, TalkSport, other commercial channels all come under their rubric. And the BBC's dominance, of course, is much more obvious in the case of television, like 75% of the latest count. But as I stressed earlier, the role of the BBC as a balance is qualified by the evidence we have about what happened in the last general election. What would be very useful is to just have a big overall picture of plurality, looking at these different media channels and making an overall assessment of it. Ofcom has tried to do that. They came out with estimates that the BBC had about 44%, Sky and News Corp taken together about 17%, and ITV, ITN about 14%. But a counter view is that news coverage doesn't fully capture the content, and that what you should be looking at is revenue, because revenue also determines the capacity of a media channel for acquiring high-quality journalists, for bidding for prestigious programs, and on a revenue analysis, the news channel, the News Corporation, actually proved slightly larger than the BBC, and they're clearly the dominant media outlets. And it's a controversial measure, but it does suggest that the BBC and the commercial channels are more evenly matched than is initially apparent. So let me get to the concluding section and the whole issue about what we do about this. There's no point just dying by analysis, because you want people to find out what potentially at least can be done. I think I start with the most serious problem, and one that has received nothing like enough attention, which is the whole issue of local print journalism, the death of local print journalism, effectively, and the growth of monopoly at a local level. I mean, I've seen this locally, and many of you have in my part of London. We used to have a local newspaper, I think 7 years ago. A very good local newspaper, happened to be owned by the Dimbleby Group, with a large team of journalists, very professional, very well informed, a local journal of record. Now it's all gone, and we have a newscast freebie with, I think, 1 or 2 journalists covering about 3 different boroughs. And that's happened across the country. The question is, what can we do about it? Because you can't bring back the past, you can't put the digital genie back in the bottle. So, what do we do about this? There are some interesting ideas around. I'll just summarise them. Other people can talk about the practicalities. There's a very good Res Republica essay by a man called Justin Schlossberg. And what he advocates, this seems basically sensible to me, is a small levy on the main media providers which aggregate news, like Facebook, Google, Microsoft, apply a small levy and use the levy for funding a media plurality organisation, independent obviously of government and the media owners themselves, and using it to finance local journalism, particularly in new and innovative providers, or where there is a yearning and a great need for investigative journalism at a local level. I should add that they weren't just making recommendations about the private sector, they were also very highly critical of the BBC, because its news management is very, very highly concentrated, and they argued for decentralisation there too. What could one do as a result of attempts to open up local competition, local plurality? There's a particular problem which is now emerging, that as the government moves to create more decentralised government through powerful mayors in combined authorities, we can see this in Manchester, Liverpool and elsewhere, who is holding these politicians to account? It may just be, in many cases, only one print newspaper. Very powerful position and very little check on, very little by way of checks and balances. And one potential way of doing this would be to insist on an election purdah in such situations, or using structural remedies, share divestment, to insist on greater plurality in many of these situations. A second policy issue that I think we need to go back to is the issue, of course, I was directly involved in, which is the whole question of how do you deal with plurality at a national level. Since the failed B-Sky B takeover, that whole issue has gone into abeyance, but it may not remain in abeyance forever. We clearly need some clarification, and I speak as somebody who had to grapple with the policy issues here. The public interest test is very weak and very unclear. It doesn't deal with organic changes in the sector, it just deals with transactions, takeovers. The whole concept of media convergence was not understood, and cross-media ownership wasn't properly dealt with at the time. Ofcom in 2015 did come up with a better framework for dealing with this, but clearly an awful lot more needs to be done. And I think one particular thing needs to be addressed is how you define the trigger points at which you have a dominant concern, where plurality has gone. Ofcom have so far declined to come up with any numbers, any metrics for that. But if you're one of the companies involved, you need to know where you stand, and if you're a policymaker, you need to understand where there's a problem. So we are in an unsatisfactory state of affairs. The third policy area I want to touch on is one that I suspect is much closer to the hearts of many people here, which is the whole issue about how you give effect to Lord Leveson's main recommendation, which was the, quote, genuinely independent and effective system of self-regulation. It's worth reminding ourselves that Lord Leveson's was the 7th attempt in 70 years to get to grips with what was a fundamentally unsatisfactory problem, and how to deal essentially with bad behaviour in the press. And to create an organisation that is, quote, genuinely independent both of government and of the proprietors and editors. I was never deeply involved in this issue, but I was in the cabinet when we received the Leveson report. And I do recall the initial burst of enthusiasm, which lasted a few days, for trying to have a cross-party approach to it. I don't need to rehearse all the tortuous political history which has led us where we are, but I think actually nothing quite illustrates the lack of true plurality than the fact that over this issue, parties have seen advantages in sucking up to proprietors, and the politicians are terrified of crossing them. And that actually, I think, is the heart of the problem. The government, as you know, has now made a decision to consult on the framework for self-regulation, which has had the effect of stopping progress towards a solution based on the Royal Charter model. It's worth remembering, incidentally, that the Royal Charter model was based on an idea from one of my Conservative colleagues, Oliver Letwin, based on an analogy with professional bodies like the Law Society, but that proved too much. The panel, which is on stage afterwards, I think is actually more qualified to talk about that than I am. But suffice it to say that the scandals which led to Leveson will continue in the absence of any proper checks and balances and mechanisms to deal with them. I think a particular problem that we do now increasingly need to focus on is the blurring of the boundaries between truth and fact. We're all familiar with the old spoofs about, Elvis Presley's alive and well on the moon, or, Princess Diana was murdered by the royal family. But those, in this strange world where truth and fact get intermingled, is that those will be presented as issues of fact, with potentially horrendous consequences. I don't know whether you followed the news story today about the United States and this fake news website that put out that a certain restaurant was acting as a haven for Hillary Clinton's paedophile network, and a guy wandered in with a gun and shot the place up. And so these things have consequences. And I think that even at the popular end of the popular press, these matters should be of concern. And it does underline the importance of an independent self-regulatory mechanism for identifying serious error and correcting it. I think the recent example of the industry self-regulating body finding serious fault with the Sun over a high-profile misrepresentation of immigration statistics, and then obtaining a very diffident reaction on page 2, I think explains the continued scepticism about the effectiveness of the current regime. But the infraction of the industry code in that case is relatively minor compared with some of the really egregious abuses that are now being perpetrated online. It's increasingly untenable, in my view, to regard online platforms as completely independent of the content that they carry. And their owners go to quite extraordinary lengths to avoid any sense of responsibility. I recall in government we made actually quite modest attempts to deal with issues like copyright theft, cyberbullying, and ran into a wall of resistance. Or to take one incident I remember, there would be a lot of the stuff that was being peddled on some of the main internet platforms presented a threat to national security, as it happened. And the typically heavy-handed Home Office response was to propose increasing mass surveillance. And I rather, perhaps in my naivety and lack of knowledge, suggested to the Cabinet that we might insist that the internet companies exercise some control over all this. I mean, judging by the expression on the faces that I encountered, I might have been recommending bombing the Vatican. It was so alarming that one should do this. But there has to be some accountability, and there has to be some accountability for the algorithms, which are secret, and which are used and are being manipulated. I think there has to be a situation where there are named individuals in the big internet company who can be held account for some of the abuses that are happening through them, not necessarily, of course, by them. And bringing this item within the framework of voluntary self-regulation would, I think, have the considerable merit of reassuring the print proprietors, who tend to exaggerate, I think, the inflictions that are being made on them, that they're not being singled out as they sometimes claim for special treatment. But just to draw this to a conclusion, freedom of expression is absolutely crucial. It's a fundamental part of our democracy. It must be preserved. And we can see what happens in an increasing number of authoritarian regimes where that freedom is being put at risk, and it mustn't happen here. But we are very, very far from such a world, and the biggest danger is unregulated excess. Thank you.